Cities are some of the most important zones in a role-playing game. They act as havens where players can restock on supplies, upgrade their gear, and even interact with some of their favorite NPCs. And having a city that feels alive can really enhance the experience when playing an RPG because it helps make the world feel more believable. And there are a ton of immersive video game cities in RPGs. Novigrad and Beauclair from The Witcher 3, Night City from Cyberpunk, Saint-Denis from Red Dead Redemption 2, and Baldur's Gate from Baldur's Gate 3, just to name a few. But I want to focus on two Bethesda titles, one that's a household name for its world, history, and cultural impact, and another that's a household name for all the wrong reasons. And what separates these two titles in terms of how they execute their cities is the quality of their world building. It feels like Skyrim's world has a lot more thought put into it, giving the cities more depth and personality, while Starfield's feel empty and lifeless despite the technological advancements. Good world building is why Skyrim cities feel believable and immersive, while Starfield's feel fake. And to start things off, let me ask you a question. What would you think is the first thing that a human settlement has to have access to? And if you answered water, you probably played Civilization, and you're goddamn right. And that's because water is what sustains human communities. It allows agriculture to be possible, creates industry through fishing. With technological advancements, water can also be used to create energy, and not to mention, it's a basic need for all forms of life. It's why, historically speaking, human beings first settled near bodies of water like rivers, lakes, and even the ocean. And remember that in the world of the Elder Scrolls, Skyrim is the first province to be populated by mankind. So if you take a look at Skyrim's map, every single hold's capital has direct access to water. There are your coastal cities, Solitude, Dawnstar, Winterhold, and Windhelm. There's also Whiterun, which is literally named after the White River that runs alongside it. Markarth in the Reach has a natural river running through the city thanks to its waterfall, and then it connects to the Karth River. Riften is partly built on top of Lake Honric. Morthal is on the edge of some marshlands. And Falkreath, while being a bit of a walk to Lake Ilinalta, also seems to have some sort of body of water, giving it a river that runs along the side of the city. Every single one of Skyrim's cities has a source of water, and I can't say the same for Starfield. New Atlantis has a giant waterfall, thus it's reasonable to assume that it has a water supply. Then there's Neon, which is a city that's built standing above an entire ocean. But then we get to the capital of the Freestar Collective, Aquila City, and it's seemingly in the middle of nowhere. There's no river, no lake, and it's hundreds of miles away from the nearest coastline. All there is to it is a bunch of Ashta and Badlands. And while that does help capture Aquila's wild western feel, the exact location doesn't seem like a realistic place to start a settlement. Like I said, human civilization tends to settle near bodies of water for the main reasons I listed earlier. There are even farms outside of Aquila City, which is presumably how they keep the city fed. However, there's never really an explanation as to how Aquila gets its water. I mean, I guess you can assume that the city's water supply comes from groundwater and trade, but that just seems like unnecessary extra steps and raises even more questions. We know that Aquila the planet can support life, and it does have water. So why didn't the first settlers choose somewhere nearer to a body of water when establishing their city? They could have surveyed the entire planet, and they just so happened to choose a spot that's far away from any kind of water when you can literally just travel a few 100,000 miles away and settle by a coast? Or if not a coast, find a lake or a river and take out a lot of steps from the water supply problem. Are we to just believe that Solomon Coe and the first settlers found an underground aquifer, put in the work to drill into it, and probably use a supply line to give them water in the meantime, costing fuel and other resources, all while the local wildlife is trying to eat them alive? Are Bethesda's devs trying to tell us that Solomon Coe and his crew would much rather do that than spend a bit more time looking for a lake or a river? This is the first human settlement on the entire planet. Why didn't they just make it easy on themselves and settle nearer to a body of water? Now, I'm not saying it's completely unrealistic for a city to be founded despite there being no bodies of water nearby, but there has to be another reason for settlers to stay in and grow the area in spite of it. One good example of this in real life is Johannesburg, located in South Africa. The city has no natural lakes nor rivers nearby and is miles away from the coastline, and yet the population of the city boomed with settlers primarily from Europe and America choosing to live in the area. Why? Because it turns out the area around Johannesburg was a literal gold mine, and people from all over the world heard about it and were flooding in to take part of the gold rush in the 1800s. Now, Johannesburg is the biggest city in South Africa, due in large part to its history, with many of its families being descendants of those same gold miners. But going back to Aquila, we're left wondering why Solomon Coe and the rest of the first Freestar families chose to settle in this specific area in the first place. Aquila, the planet, can harbor life, but is the specific spot that the city is in rich in minerals? If so, why don't we see a drilling operation, or a lumbering operation, or a hunting industry? We know that Aquila has good soil because it has a few farms on the outside of the city, but again, where's the water then? Heck, they needed to build a wall to ensure that they don't end up as food for the Ashta, so why not choose somewhere where the Ashta wouldn't be as much of a problem as they are? What makes this exact area on the planet worth settling down in? We're kinda left just wondering why. And the funny thing is, a different Starfield city has an answer to those same questions. Cydonia, the mostly underground UC city located on Mars. We're explicitly shown that Cydonia is a mining settlement. When you first enter Cydonia, you can immediately tell that this is a mining colony. On the surface, there's a ton of machinery, digging up mounds and mounds of Mars dirt. And then when you go inside, there's even more of those machines, and people using their laser cutters on some rocks. Heck, you can even harvest some metal for yourself. And in the lore of Starfield, we know that the metals are used by Deimos star yards. So Mars as an entire planet cannot support life, but Cydonia as a settlement is worth establishing in spite of that, simply because of the resources in the area, much like Johannesburg. The issue is, we just don't get that with Aquila. We don't know why Solomon Coe chose to establish the city in that specific spot when there would likely be better spots elsewhere on the planet. And speaking of natural resources, part of the reason Skyrim's world feels so immersive is because it feels like each capital city has their own economy driven by the resources within each hold. For example, Riften, capital of the Rift and one of the game's major cities, has a thriving fishing industry thanks to its proximity to Lake Ilinalta. Not only that, but since the Rift is a heavily wooded area, we know that lumber is in no short supply in the Rift, and the game implies this through the architecture of the city. Most of the buildings in Riften are made primarily, if not entirely, out of wood. The city also has wooden upper and lower walkways, and the entire fishing dock area is just made of wood as well. The Rift as a whole is also home to two different mills, Heartwood Mill, which is located on the side of Lake Ilinalta that is opposite to Riften, and the Iverstead Mill run by Temba Whitearm. It shares this trait with Halfingar and Falkreath, which are also heavily forested regions. But also, the deciduous forests of the Rift are teeming with bees, making it a good place to start a meadery, something the Blackbriar family, more on them later, know all too well. Thus, it makes sense why people would want to settle in Riften. The natural resources in the area gives its citizens a ton of opportunity to make a livelihood. It makes sense why Riften's founders, whoever they may be, would have wanted to settle in that specific spot. In fact, I can say that for all of Skyrim's old capitals, including the more inconsequential ones like Morthal and Dawnstar. Morthal is located near marshlands and is the closest thing Skyrim has to a flyover state. Seriously, if it weren't for the fact that the hold is linked to some pretty important quest lines, there would be very little reason to visit the place on a regular playthrough. However, in terms of world building, it would make sense why some people would want to live in Morthal. Hjalmarch's marshes are dense with resources, not just with lumber and fish, but also with rare alchemical ingredients like deathbell and swamp fungal pods. In fact, the latter only grows naturally in the marshes of Hjalmarch. It is still a swamp though, and fewer people would want to live there, but it would make sense that some people could see the opportunity that Morthal has and settle there despite the drawbacks. Moving on to Dawnstar, first of all, it's a coastal city, thus would already be a good location for fishing and trade, but it's also apparently rich in minerals, as evidenced by the presence of not one but two different mines. Dawnstar would be a great city to settle if you're looking for work. It's not just a place with an invisible magic chest. And I could give you a write-up for every other city in Skyrim, but this video would just take so much longer and I'm not interested in doing that. The point that I'm trying to make here is that there's a feasible reason for Skyrim cities to exist, exist where they are in-game. It's reasonable to assume that early settlers would look at the specific spots that the cities were built and would start civilizations there. And this is something that a few of Starfield's cities are kind of lacking in. I've already talked about Aquila and how there's really nothing there, but New Atlantis is also kind of guilty. We're told that New Atlantis' settlers chose the location due to the presence of a waterfall, and they thought they could use it to power their city. That's smart. Bethesda gave them a reason why they would want to settle down in that specific spot. But the thing is, they had an entire planet's worth of waterfalls to choose from. The game doesn't tell us that they chose the largest waterfall in Jemison or the tallest one. They just chose a waterfall. And when you're working with a planetary scale, you kind of have to think about questions like this. Why did New Atlantis' settlers choose this specific waterfall out of an entire planet of options? But if there's one thing that I do like about New Atlantis, it's the well. It's a district in the city that's pretty much underground, and I find the lore behind it to be quite interesting too. It turns out that the well was the original New Atlantis. It was there first, and then the rest of the city that we see was built on top of it, effectively hiding it. But you compare the well to the rest of New Atlantis, and the difference is stark. While New Atlantis is vibrant, open, and colorful, the well is cramped, shoddy, and devoid of sunlight. And it's also heavily implied that this is where the poorer members of New Atlantis' society stay in. New Atlantis feels fake because it is fake. The high-tech, futuristic city that we're introduced to isn't all there is to New Atlantis. In fact, the depressing, sunlight-deprived slums of the well are lore-wise the real New Atlantis. Just like, when you think about it, the United Colonies like to paint themselves as a heroic fashion, but are honestly pretty damn dirty underneath all that jazz. And if that's what the devs were going for, they're geniuses for that, and I have to hand them their flowers. But I still have to judge New Atlantis as a whole, and overall, it can honestly feel like a city with no personality besides being the United Colonies capital. It doesn't do anything at all to separate itself from the UC, and thus doesn't have a personality besides being a hub for the United Colonies. And the thing is, Skyrim did a pretty decent job despite its technical drawbacks at creating capital cities that felt like they were more than just their governments. Solitude, the imperial capital of Skyrim, is also a cultured city. Here, you'll find the Temple of the Divines, which is unique in the sense that it has a shrine dedicated to all of the Divines, except for Talos, unless you complete the Stormcloak questline. It also has the Bard's College, where aspiring bards can learn and hone their skills. Do I wish I could become a legitimate bard in vanilla Skyrim? Yes, I do. But the point is, Solitude still feels like its own city, and not just a place that the Empire occupies. Same goes for Windhelm. Yes, it's the seat of the Stormcloaks and the heart of the rebellion, but it's also the oldest city in Skyrim, and the oldest human settlement in the entirety of Tamriel. It's where the Morans first settled down when entering the continent, and being such an important historical site for humanity, it kinda makes sense that the Nords who live there would be as racist as they are. In comparison, it feels like New Atlantis is so focused on being the seat of the United Colonies that there's really nothing else to it. And thus the city feels bland and without any culture or personality, and in that sense, it doesn't emulate the feeling of a real city. Because if you ask anybody who's lived in a big city their entire lives to accurately describe and capture the essence of their home city in a single sentence, they'd probably have a difficult time doing it. Because cities are these hubs of human civilization that are so big that they naturally develop multiple facets over time. New York City, for example, can be described in so many different ways. You can call it a melting pot thanks to its huge population of different minorities and its many neighborhoods like Chinatown and the Bronx. But it's also a busy city with millions of men and women working all over, whether they're on the streets selling hot dogs or $2 pizza slices, or office workers adorning the city's skyscrapers. It's also the trading hub for the world's biggest economy thanks to the presence of Wall Street. Thus, the name New York conjures up images of men and women in suits, throwing papers into the air, taking phone calls, and trying to make money. But it's also a coastal city, therefore it has beaches and boats ready to welcome tourists with open arms. You can't really describe New York completely with just a single sentence. It simply has too many different traits that trying to say that it's just one thing would not do it justice. Skyrim's major cities, while much smaller in scale, also at least attempt to be multifaceted. Windhelm is the seat of the Stormcloaks, but it's also the oldest human city and is said to be built by the first men to visit Tamriel. But not only does it have a human population, but it also has a large Argonian and Dunmer population thanks to circumstance. So it's a city with a lot of history, but also ironically, diversity. Solitude is the largest city in Skyrim, but it's also arguably the most cultured thanks to the presence of entities like the Bard's College and the Temple of Divines. And while all of Skyrim's major cities have their own feel to their buildings, Solitude seemed to be the most regal and unique. Not to mention, during the events of Skyrim, the city is the capital of the province and is the imperial seat of power. Markarth is the city of stone, carved into the side of a mountain, but also on top of an entire Dwemer ruin. The city is also incredibly vertical, with many stone arches and cliffs that can be found within the premises. It's also apparently rich in minerals, as there's a silver mine right in the middle of it, but also an iron mine not too far outside the premises. Culturally, the city also has a dedicated temple to both Talos and Dibella, thus places of worship for followers of those deities. And depending on who you ask, you might even be told that Markarth isn't even a part of Skyrim, but the city and the entire Reach region with it belongs to the native Reachmen. Riften is a lawless city where crime runs rampant thanks to the presence of the Thieves Guild. In fact, when you enter for the first time, you get shaken down by a guard, but it is also home to arguably one of the most important temples to the people of Skyrim in the Temple of Mara, where most people would learn about marriage and get married to their beloved. But it's also a highly industrial city with thriving fishing, brewing, and trade industries. In fact, the city has so many people with jobs that there's a building dedicated to housing its working men and women. And Whiterun, my personal favorite city in Skyrim, is at the very heart of the province, making it a trading hub. And you can honestly feel it. The city has a Fletcher in addition to 2 blacksmiths, and that Fletcher also kind of functions as a second inn, an apothecary, a general store, and a bunch of market stalls as well. It's also said to be a pilgrimage spot thanks to the presence of the Gildergleam and the Temple of Kinnereth, and the seat of the Jarl was built to capture, and historically did capture, a goddamn dragon. On top of that, the central location holds a narrative purpose. Because the city is in the center of the province during a civil war, it would also be the most polarized city in terms of its views on the conflict. And we see this through the feud of clans Greymane and Battleborn. And before beginning the questline, Jarl Balgruuf is also undecided on which side he should join in the war. And this is without mentioning the fact that the city was built around Jorrvaskr, the mead hall of the legendary warriors that we know as the Companions. And then we get back to Starfield cities. Aquila is just a hub for the Freestar Collective. It's the space cowboy city, and there's nothing in the city that separates it from that one-dimensional narrative. The center building, the Rock, is the space cantina where the space cowboys gather. And if you're following the story, the first time you're intended to go here is with your space cowboy buddy. Interestingly, there is a rather large disconnect between the richer and poorer families in Aquila, but this is more of a theme of Starfield cities rather than a reflection of the city itself. Neon, New Atlantis, and Aquila all have a drastic gap between the rich and the poor, thus I can't really say with confidence that it's a trait that's unique to Aquila. The same goes for New Atlantis. It's just the United Colonies city. UC propaganda is all over. One of the first things you see upon entering New Atlantis is a sign to sign up for the Vanguard or for UC security. Now, this does help flesh out the UC as a faction, but it doesn't tell you much about New Atlantis, the city. If you take away the UC from New Atlantis, what even is there left? And the answer would be the Lodge owned by Constellation, but that also creates more questions than answers. Constellation as a faction is said to be independent from the United Colonies, but how does that work when their bases of operation, the Lodge and the Eye, are both explicitly in UC territory? This is weird because the Lodge was built inside New Atlantis. The city became the capital in 2161, but the Lodge and Constellation with it were built in 2275, almost 100 years after New Atlantis' founding. So this means that Constellation was founded in UC territory. So why is it allowed to be an independent entity when it benefits from United Colonies security and protocols? If Constellation is supposed to be independent, why not build the Lodge on a different planet or stay in a space station like the Eye to truly hammer home that they're supposed to be able to stand alone? And it's also weird because nobody else really acknowledges Constellation within the city. There aren't any children asking what that big building is in the corner there or whatever it is. People kind of just don't give a damn. In fact, in the opening scene of the game, Heller even questions whether constellation exists. This is just a very weird handling of an independent entity, especially considering how Skyrim handles independent entities, namely the Companions. The Companions are independent from Whiterun's government. They're not part of the city guard and couldn't care less about who runs Whiterun. They do their own thing and don't mind if the city gets invaded by the Stormcloaks or whatever. The faction as a whole doesn't take a side during the Civil War and generally don't care for whoever wins, except for Vignar, who would become Jarl should the Stormcloaks take the city, but he doesn't represent the whole group. And it makes sense because the lore states that the Companions built Jorrvaskr by the Skyforge to have access to Great Steel, and the city of Whiterun was then built around the Jorrvaskr, much like how towns and cities in real life were also built around taverns and the like. So people kind of just decided to build their houses near the Companions, and they didn't really have a say on whether or not they could do that. And the Companions are very much acknowledged. Whiterun's guards talk about the Companions in reverence. Uthgerd the Unbroken, an NPC, has beef with the group for not letting her join, and if you're following Bethesda's intended route, the first time you see members of the group, they're slaying a giant on Whiterun's soil. They are an independent entity, but they still are very much a part of the world and a part of Whiterun. They're allowed to operate on city soil because the city was built around them anyway. And speaking of building a city around certain people, another thing that I kind of find missing in New Atlantis are people of influence. A big part of central major cities are influential individuals. These are usually people from old money families or political families or both. These are your Rockefellers or even Trumps. These are family names that hold a lot of swing in the city, names that you use to get into exclusive establishments or to help talk your way out of a parking ticket. They don't necessarily have to be crime families like the fictional Corleones of New York or the Falcones of Gotham, but there are usually going to be richer families living in a city that people know about. And Starfield understands this because we do have influential families in the game, just not in New Atlantis. Neon has the Bayous, with Benjamin Bayou pretty much owning the city in addition to being the CEO of Xenofresh Corporation. And Aquila has the founding families living in the core, particularly the Coe family. But what about the UC? Are you to tell me that New Atlantis doesn't have elites that are publicly known, or at least spoken about as an open secret? Because having those influential families and being able to see and interact with them does help with the immersion. It may seem surface level, but having NPCs that are hella rich make the world seem more alive, especially because Skyrim makes it a point to include wealthy families and clans in each of its major cities. Windhelm has the Shatter Shields, and you may even count the Stormcloaks despite us only meeting Ulfric. Riften has the Snowshods and the Blackbriars, with Maven, the matriarch of the latter, becoming Jarl should the Empire take the Rift. Markarth has the Silverbloods, with Thongvor Silverblood becoming Jarl of the city should the Stormcloaks take the Reach. Perhaps most notably, Whiterun has the Battleborns and the Greymanes, and finally, Solitude has the cousin of the very Emperor of Tamriel. Perhaps the richest and most influential person that we actually get to meet in New Atlantis is Walter Stroud, CEO of Stroud Eklund, but as a character, he's more linked to Constellation rather than to New Atlantis as a city. We see the impoverished in the Wells, so where are the elites of New Atlantis? One of the most prominent criticisms that I see about Starfield cities online is that they feel empty. And one of the reasons that I think that is because Starfield seems to lack flavor buildings. These are buildings that seemingly serve no other purpose to the player other than showing that the world exists without them. Unless you're playing a thief character and trying to steal as much as possible, there is absolutely no reason to enter quite a few of the buildings in Skyrim. For example, the Markarth Treasury House does absolutely nothing for the player. In fact, when spoken to, the NPC that mans the counter will immediately tell you that they don't cater to you. The location does serve a use in the Forsworn Conspiracy questline, acting as the home of the Silverbloods, but that's about it. Meanwhile, the buildings of Starfield feel very intentional. Almost everywhere you go to in New Atlantis is some sort of store where you can buy materials for crafting, weapons and ammo, medical supplies, and food. Meanwhile, there are a lot of buildings in Skyrim cities that serve more or less no purpose to the player outside of a few very niche scenarios. Places like the Riften Fishery, the Temple of Kinnereth in Whiterun, the Treasury House in Markarth, and the Temple of Talos in Windhelm. These places don't do anything for the player, you kinda just go in once and never again. But these are subtle reminders that the world is alive. And I think the big difference is in NPC housing. Besides maybe the beggar characters, most NPCs in Skyrim have a home with a bed or stay at the local inn. And while yes, in terms of execution, a lot of the interiors are reused and some are just copy-pasted within cities, but the point is we see these NPCs eat, sleep, and live normal lives, which is why the world of Skyrim feels alive. And this leads me to one of the most prominent criticisms people have with Starfield, which is the lack of NPC schedules. In Skyrim and Fallout 4, shopkeepers weren't perpetually open like they are in Starfield. Certain quest lines were also locked behind time of day, as sometimes NPCs would be sleeping. And if you try to enter the NPC's house at night, the game would tell you that you're trespassing and they'd tell you to get out. But presumably for gameplay reasons, Starfield stores are always open for the player to enter and trade in, and while it is convenient, it does make the world of Starfield feel less alive. Shopkeepers only being open at certain times was a good thing. Not only did it serve a gameplay purpose, giving the player a reason to interact with the game's day and night cycle feature, but it also served to remind us that the NPCs react like we would to our world. But you don't have to sacrifice immersion and world building for convenience. Why not keep these 24/7 stores open, but have different NPCs take shifts during certain time intervals? They literally did this in Fallout 4, with one store in Diamond City being run by Crazy Myrna during the day, but at night her Mr. Handy robot takes over so she can get some rest. This was a pretty smart way to make trading in Diamond City convenient while still making the city feel alive. And this is part of the reason why Starfield cities feel so fake in comparison. When you trade your latest haul, you're not trading with NPCs or characters with different lives. You're trading with robotic shopkeepers that never eat, sleep, or bathe. This video isn't meant to be just hating on Starfield and praising Skyrim. In fact, when doing the research for these videos, I'm surprised that Starfield cities are as thought out as they are. The issue I have is that there's just enough holding these cities back from being great. If Starfield nails anything with their cities, it's the vibes. But when it comes to world building, Bethesda has so much to learn, which is ironic considering how immersive, fleshed out, and believable Skyrim's world is. And that's the end of this video. Leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed the content, and leave a comment about your thoughts on the topic. Let me know if you want to see more videos like this, since I definitely enjoyed writing the script for it. That's all for now, and ace out.